December 1941. The fields west of Moscow are frozen solid, a white graveyard stretching to the horizon. The temperature has fallen to -40. Rifles jam, engines refuse to start. Men beat their hands against their chests just to feel something. Anything. The German army, victorious since June, now bleeds into the snow. Their summer uniforms stiffen into rags. Their breath freezes in the air, and the Red Army, the army that was supposed to be dead, is coming back to life. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. It was the largest invasion in human history, a storm of armor, artillery and arrogance stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Wehrmacht called it Operation Barbarossa, a campaign meant to crush the Soviet Union in 8 weeks. 8 weeks. By August, the Red Army had lost 4 million men. Entire fronts had disintegrated. Kiev, Smolensk, Minsk, gone. German officers sent home postcards of burning cities and endless wheat fields. Another few months, they wrote, and the war will be over. But there were warning signs. The distances were too great. The roads too few. Soviet factories were vanishing eastward, disassembled, shipped, rebuilt beyond the Urals. Fuel convoys ran dry. Tanks broke down. Horses starved. Still, the Germans advanced. By October, Army Group Center stood 200 kilometers from Moscow. The leaves fell, the skies opened, and the earth dissolved into mud. Panzer divisions that had raced across Europe now crawled forward at walking speed. Trucks sank to their axles. Supply trains stalled for weeks. Then came the frost, and the frost never left. When the snow settled, it buried more than the roads. It buried the myth of invincibility. The Wehrmacht had conquered Europe in a series of lightning strikes, but here, in the forests of Russia, lightning froze. And behind the storm front, in the wreckage of burned villages and shattered factories, a different kind of army was forming, one that wouldn't stop at defense. In late November 1941, the German advance toward Moscow ground to a halt. On paper, they were still winning. The front line lay just 20 miles from the Soviet capital. In reality, the offensive was disintegrating. Supply lines stretched over 600 miles back to Poland. Horses collapsed in their harnesses. Trucks ran without oil, their engines seizing in the cold. Soldiers tore pages from field manuals to light fires. They called it the Russian winter, but that phrase doesn't capture what it was. It wasn't winter. It was annihilation by temperature. At -30, metal became brittle. Rifle bolts froze solid. Machine guns had to be urinated on before they would fire. Soldiers carried their weapons inside their coats, pressing them to their bodies for warmth, and then burned their hands on the freezing metal when they took them out. Uniforms that had been designed for the fields of France were useless in the steppes of Russia. Greatcoats, gloves, felt boots, all had been promised. Few arrived. The quartermasters were miles behind, bogged down in snowdrifts that swallowed entire convoys. Men wrapped themselves in curtains, tablecloths, whatever they could tear from abandoned homes. Some stole Soviet coats from the dead. Others froze before they could. In early December, the temperature near Moscow dropped to -42. Frostbite claimed thousands. Skin turned white, then black. Fingers snapped off like icicles. Faces blistered and peeled. German soldiers stopped shaving, not for vanity, but survival. The frost clung less to beards than bare skin. Field kitchens froze. Bread turned to stone. Men hacked at it with bayonets, soaked it in water, waited hours for it to thaw enough to chew. And through it all, the orders never changed. Hold your position. Prepare for attack. There would be no retreat. The Führer had declared that the German army would never take a step backward. So they stood, knee-deep in snow, fighting phantoms. At night, the forest echoed with sounds that didn't belong to the living. The cracking of frozen corpses, the slow moan of wind through empty helmets. Horses lay dead by the hundreds along the roads, their bodies used as windbreaks. Tanks, drained of fuel, became shelters. Men crawled inside their hulls to escape the wind, waking up next to the frozen bodies of their friends. Then came the snowstorms. Visibility dropped to meters. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly supplies. What fuel existed was rationed for ambulances, and even they barely moved. Field hospitals overflowed. The surgeons operated with knives warmed over candles. They amputated without anesthetic. The screams froze in the air, and still, from beyond the horizon, came the sound of artillery. At first sporadic, then constant. The Red Army, written off as dead in the summer, was stirring. Entire divisions appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Fresh uniforms, new rifles, Siberian troops hardened by even colder climates. They had been held in the east, guarding against Japan, but intelligence had confirmed that Tokyo would not strike. Stalin unleashed them west. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. Soldiers in white camouflage moving silently through the snow. Skis instead of boots. They fought with a calm precision that only the cold could teach. Where German rifles jammed, Soviet Mosins fired. Where Germans froze, Soviets endured. By early December, the Wehrmacht was no longer attacking. It was surviving. Frontline officers begged for permission to withdraw. The answer from Berlin was the same every time. Hold the line. So they held it, until the line broke. December 5, 1941. The temperature hovered around -40. For weeks, German soldiers had been told that the Soviets were finished, that Moscow was within reach, that the Red Army had no reserves left. Then, before dawn, came the sound. A low rolling thunder from the forests east of Klin, Kalinin, and Tula. At first, men thought it was distant weather. Then the horizon lit up, lines of red flame cutting through the dark. The Soviet artillery had returned to life. The Red Army was no longer the shattered, desperate force of summer. These were Siberian divisions, veterans of cold, trained to fight where others froze. They came wearing white, moving through the snow like ghosts. Behind them thundered the Katyusha rocket launchers, the organs of Stalin, their wailing howls echoing across the plains. When they fired, they turned the night into a storm of fire and ice. At first, the Germans didn't understand. They thought it was a local counterattack, something small, something they could repel. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of the Soviet winter offensive, a front-wide eruption stretching hundreds of kilometers. At Klin, entire regiments of the 3rd Panzer Army vanished under the Soviet advance. At Kalinin, the 9th Army fell back in chaos, its communications shattered. Around Moscow itself, the Red Army launched wave after wave. Infantry, cavalry, tanks painted white swarming through the forests. The Luftwaffe, grounded by the weather, could do nothing. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were running. Not retreating, running. Frostbitten soldiers abandoned their posts, stumbling through the snow, pursued by men who had once been their prisoners. The Soviets were relentless. They didn't just attack. They hunted. German tanks, immobilized by ice, were blown apart by Soviet artillery. Trucks burned where they stood. Columns of men froze in place, not because they were cowards, but because they simply couldn't move. The snow was waist-deep. Boots cracked, toes gone to frostbite. Some soldiers removed their footwear just to feel something under their feet. Most didn't live long after that. The German lines began to unravel. Command posts disappeared. Divisions dissolved. By December 10th, entire sectors were in flight. General Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, once the spearhead of the drive on Moscow, was in full retreat. "It is no longer a question of holding," he wrote. "It is a question of saving what remains." But saving what remained was almost impossible. The Red Army had learned from its summer disasters. It didn't rush headlong into traps. It advanced methodically, crushing resistance, bypassing strong points, encircling survivors. Soviet snipers moved through the white fields like predators picking off stragglers. Machine gun nests appeared overnight. Even nature seemed to turn against the invaders. The blizzards never stopped. Winds howled across the steppe, carrying snow so thick it blinded entire units. German artillerymen fired blindly into the storm. The shells exploded somewhere out there, unseen, unheard. By mid-December, Moscow was no longer under immediate threat. The Red Army pushed westward, reclaiming town after town. Soviet propaganda blared across the front lines. "The fascists are freezing. Their empire is dying in the snow." And for once, it wasn't just propaganda. In some villages, German soldiers begged to be captured. Others refused, knowing what captivity meant. Many simply lay down in the snow, exhausted, their weapons beside them, and never stood up again. The German command tried to restore order. Hitler himself took control of the army, issuing orders directly from his headquarters in East Prussia. There would be no retreat, no withdrawal. The Führer demanded that every position be held to the last man. "The German soldier," he declared, must learn to stand fast. But standing fast meant dying in place. It meant fighting until there was no ammunition, no warmth, no life left. Officers who tried to pull back were dismissed or arrested. Some shot themselves rather than freeze to death waiting for orders that would never come. By Christmas, the front line was chaos. Entire corps had ceased to exist as coherent units. The great promise of Operation Barbarossa, the quick, decisive victory that would crush the Soviet Union, lay shattered beneath the snowdrifts of Western Russia. And somewhere, beyond the smoke and frost, the Red Army marched on, its soldiers singing through the blizzard. They had seen their cities burn, their families die, their comrades fall by the millions. Now, they were fighting not for Stalin, not for ideology, but for revenge. The German army had come to conquer the East. Instead, it found an enemy that refused to die, and a winter that would not forgive. By January 1942, the dream of a quick victory in the East was dead. The German army, once the most feared force on earth, now staggered through the snow like a wounded animal. What had begun as blitzkrieg, fast, precise, unstoppable, had become something else entirely, a slow-motion catastrophe spread across 1,000 frozen kilometers. In the ruins of half-buried villages, soldiers huddled in cellars and burned furniture to stay alive. Ammunition was scarce, food scarcer still. Bread rations shrank to a few ounces a day. Soup became melted snow with a few gray scraps floating in it, sometimes horse meat, sometimes worse. Entire companies lived off frozen potatoes dug from fields beneath the ice. Many didn't bother cooking them anymore. They simply gnawed and swallowed, teeth cracking in the cold. The letters home, if they were written at all, were short. Still alive, still cold. Some added, "We are forgotten." And they were. The High Command's maps still showed neat lines and clear objectives, but on the ground there were no lines, only scattered men, groups of 10, 20, clinging to survival. Discipline began to fray. Officers disappeared in the night. Desertions rose, suicides too. When replacements arrived, they were boys. Conscripts pulled from occupied Europe, unprepared for the cold. They came dressed in thin wool and died within days. Veterans tried to warn them, never touch metal with bare hands. Don't sleep too close to the fire, you won't wake up. Few survived long enough to learn why. The Soviets, meanwhile, had found their rhythm. For the first time in the war, they moved with confidence. They had new weapons, the T-34 tanks, their wide tracks gliding over snow that swallowed German panzers whole. The Red Air Force returned to the skies. The propaganda machine thundered. Moscow stands. The motherland strikes back! Posters appeared in every town, grim-faced soldiers raising red flags over burning tanks. The message was clear. The invincible invaders could bleed, could freeze, could die. For the Germans, the psychological collapse was worse than the physical one. They had been told the Soviets were inferior, subhuman, untrained, unarmed. But what they faced now were soldiers who refused to stop. Soviet attacks came in waves day and night. Wounded men crawled forward firing until their last breath. Snipers watched for movement. A puff of breath, a glint of steel, and shot. German units reported fighting shadows. They appear from the snow, one officer wrote. You hear nothing. Then they're among you. You kill 1, 2, 10, but they keep coming. They don't stop. By mid-January, temperatures dropped again, to -50 in some sectors. The wounded froze in minutes. Medics couldn't keep up. Bandages froze to the skin. Morphine was gone. Field hospitals became morgues. In the forests, the dead were stacked like logs, their faces turned to ice. In the rear, the situation was no better. Roads were gone, rail lines shattered. Supply columns were ambushed by Soviet partisans. Men and women who struck at night, burned convoys, vanished into the snow. German sentries stopped lighting fires. Smoke meant death, and still Hitler demanded more. He raged from his headquarters, calling the retreats cowardice. He refused to allow withdrawals, even when positions were indefensible. You will hold, he ordered. To the last man, to the last man. And the last man often froze before he ever saw the enemy, the myth of German superiority and the myth that had carried them from Warsaw to Paris, collapsed under the weight of the Russian winter. The Wehrmacht had entered the Soviet Union as conquerors. They now looked like ghosts, In one field near Vyazma, a photographer captured a column of men trudging through waist-deep snow, rifles slung, eyes hollow, faces hidden by frost. They weren't marching anymore. They were drifting. One step at a time, no words, no songs, no flag, just survival. In Moscow, the bells rang for the first time in months. The Soviet capital had stood. The city that was supposed to fall in 2 weeks had endured the might of the German army for 6 months, and won. Stalin appeared on the radio, his voice slow, deliberate. "Comrades! The enemy stands at the gates of our land, frozen and beaten. They thought the Soviet Union would fall in days. They were wrong. The fascists will die in the snow, as all invaders of Russia have before them." In the streets, soldiers wept openly. Civilians brought bread and soup to the troops. For once, hope returned to Moscow, but for the Germans, there was no hope left. The men who had come to conquer now prayed only to live through the night. Some carved their names into rifle stocks, knowing they would never see home again. Others buried letters in the snow, farewells to wives, to children, to a Germany that already felt like another world. The front, by now, was a frozen wound across the continent. Tens of thousands of men, German and Soviet, lay buried under the snow, their positions marked only by helmets or broken rifles jutting from the drifts. When the thaw came months later, farmers would find them, arms locked around each other, enemies frozen together forever. The winter of 1941 had not just stopped an army. It had shattered an illusion. That war could be controlled, that conquest had rules, that nature could be bent to man's will. In the East, the war had become something else. Not a campaign, but an abyss. And the abyss was only beginning to open. When the snow finally began to melt in March 1942, it revealed what the winter had hidden. The forests west of Moscow turned black with thawing earth, and beneath it, bodies. Thousands of them. Frozen where they fell, locked in the poses of battle, rifles half-raised, hands still clutching grenades, eyes glazed in ice. The thaw didn't bring life. It brought memory. German engineers tried to clear the roads, but every stretch uncovered another horror. Horses half buried in snow, trucks fused into the ground, tanks split open like shells. The stench rolled across the steppe, heavy and sour, the smell of a campaign that had devoured 500,000 men. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of temporary setbacks. But in the field, the truth was undeniable. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Out of the 3 million men who had marched east the previous summer, nearly 1 million were dead, wounded, or missing. The survivors were gaunt, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags. The army that had once stormed across Europe now looked like beggars in gray. They would fight on, through spring, through summer, through another 3.5 years of blood. But something fundamental had changed. The illusion of unstoppable conquest was gone. The winter had carved that lesson into every survivor's skin. For the Soviets, the victory at Moscow was more than survival. It was resurrection. Factories hidden in the Urals began to roar again. New divisions formed every week. The Red Army, battered, starving, bleeding, had proven it could not be destroyed. Stalin's words became prophecy. The Germans will freeze to death at the gates of Moscow. And they had. But the cost was beyond reckoning. Soviet losses in that single winter surpassed 1 million. Villages vanished. Cities became skeletons. The snow, when it melted, ran red with rust and blood. As spring came, the landscape changed again. The snow turned to mud, and the roads became rivers of brown, swallowing tanks and men alike. Nature, indifferent to all flags, began its slow reclamation. Birds returned. Grass pushed through the thawing earth. And somewhere, beneath the soil, the frozen dead of 2 empires lay side by side. Indistinguishable now, equal at last. The Eastern Front would go on for 3 more winters. 3 more years of unimaginable destruction. But the shape of the war had already been decided in that first winter, when a mighty empire learned that speed, will, and arrogance could not conquer the cold, nor the resolve of those who had nothing left to lose. For the men who survived it, the memory never left. They would speak of it in whispers, of nights where silence froze solid, of mornings when they woke to find their comrades turned to ice. They would remember the sound of the wind on the steppe, the cracking of trees in the frost, and the endless whiteness stretching beyond sight, a whiteness that swallowed everything, even victory. The Eastern Front winter of 1941 was not just a military turning point. It was a moment when the war revealed its true face. Not glory, not conquest, but survival against the void. And as the thaw spread across the fields, the world began to understand Hitler's empire had frozen to death at the gates of Moscow, and from the snow, a new storm was rising.